My name is Cora Donovan, and for most of my adult life, my family has believed I was adrift. They saw my departure from the Naval Academy not as a change in course, but as a shipwreck. In their tidy, disciplined world, framed by the traditions of the sea and the rigid hierarchy of military life, I was the one who had jumped overboard, leaving a legacy of service to drown in the quiet waters of mediocrity. They never asked what I did after I left. The truth is, I don't think they could have conceived of an answer that would satisfy them. Our family gatherings were rituals of polite erasure. My younger sister, Maeve, a rising star in the Navy, would be toasted with the same crystal glasses my father used to celebrate his own promotions. Her achievements were tangible, photogenic things: commendation medals, command photos, articles in the base newsletter. I, on the other hand, brought the dessert, usually a store-bought cheesecake, a silent offering from the civilian world they imagined I inhabited. A world of soft, unimportant work and unfulfilled potential. I remember one Christmas, my uncle, a retired captain with a booming voice and kind eyes, pulled me aside. "It's good of you to keep coming, Cora," he'd said, his voice a low, confidential rumble. "Shows character." I had just returned from a 3-month stint in a secure facility near the Arctic Circle, modeling climate change impact on maritime security, but to him, my greatest act of character was showing up to a family dinner. When I turned 30, I stopped hoping they would ask the right questions. When I turned 35, I stopped trying to provide the answers they weren't looking for. And yet, last month, when the crisp, formal invitation to Maeve's promotion ceremony arrived, I decided to go. Not for them, not anymore. I went for myself, to see if I could stand in the rooms of my past and not feel like a ghost. I packed a simple silk blouse and tailored trousers, clothes designed to be unremarkable, to allow me to observe without being observed. But I did not go unobserved. In the middle of the formal proceedings, a senior officer walked into the auditorium. The room seemed to contract around his presence. Admiral Cullen. His gaze, sharp and accustomed to scanning horizons, swept the room, and then, inexplicably, it settled on me. He froze for a fraction of a second, his posture shifting from relaxed authority to rigid formality. He strode down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the sudden, profound silence. He stopped before my row, turned to face me, and in front of my sister, my parents, and the entire assembled command, he rendered a crisp, perfect salute. "Director Donovan," he said, his voice clear and resonant. "It's an honor, ma'am." And in that moment, the silence in the room was no longer for Maeve's promotion or my father's legacy. It was for me. I was born in Port Blossom, Washington, in a house that smelled of salt, rain, and unspoken expectations. The walls were hung with maps of shipping lanes and framed photographs of warships cutting through gray water. My father, Declan Donovan, retired as a commander in the Naval Supply Corps, a man who organized the world into ledgers and timetables. My mother, Fiona, had been a naval nurse, a woman who knew how to set a bone and stitch a wound with terrifying efficiency, but who treated feelings as though they were low-priority ailments that would heal on their own if ignored. Our lives revolved around Naval Base Kitsap, a sprawling complex of gray buildings and piers that felt less like a workplace and more like the center of our universe. Dinner table conversations were a lexicon of acronyms: CO, XO, OPNAV, SECNAV. We learned to speak the language of the fleet before we learned to speak of ourselves. From my earliest memories, I was being groomed to take my place in the Donovan line. Stand tall, speak clearly, follow the chart. At 18, I earned an appointment to the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. It should have been a crowning achievement, the fulfillment of a generational promise. But in our family, pride was a performance. It required an audience, a uniform, a public record of success. When I left Annapolis after my first year, without a word of explanation to anyone but the superintendent, they saw it as the ultimate failure. A quiet, inexplicable surrender. No one pressed for a reason. The story they told themselves, that I couldn't handle the pressure, that I lacked the requisite steel in my spine, was simpler, and it fit neatly into their worldview. The truth was far more complex and far less public. I hadn't quit. I had been chosen. A handful of cadets and midshipmen across the service academies were identified each year for aptitudes that didn't fit neatly into a standard military career. My talent was in seeing patterns, in weaving disparate threads of data into predictive tapestries. I was recruited into a nascent civilian-led organization operating under the aegis of the Department of Defense, a strategic think tank known only as the Ariadne Initiative. Our work was to navigate the labyrinths of future conflicts, to find the threads that could lead to peaceful resolutions before the first shot was ever fired. My clearance came with a non-disclosure agreement, not a ceremony. My uniform was a business suit, not dress whites. My victories were classified reports, not medals pinned to my chest. Every crisis I helped avert, every diplomatic channel I helped open through back-end analysis, was by its very nature invisible. It had to be. My family, steeped in the visible currency of rank and ribbon, had no frame of reference for a success that was defined by its secrecy. They assumed I'd found some comfortable, inconsequential niche in a government office in Washington, D.C. I remember a phone call with my father a few years ago. He was talking to an old Navy buddy, his voice full of pride. "Maeve's doing the real work out there with the fleet. You know sea time. Cora, well, she's in DC pushes papers, I think. Good with spreadsheets." I was on the other end of the line, having called to wish him a happy birthday. I had just spent 72 straight hours coordinating a multi-agency response to a potential cyber attack on global maritime shipping infrastructure. I listened to him describe my life's work as good with spreadsheets and said nothing. How could I explain that my spreadsheets were preventing the very conflicts his generation had fought? The silence on the phone was a chasm I had long ago stopped trying to cross. Maeve, for years my junior, was the daughter they could understand. She thrived in the structured world of the Navy. She was smart, disciplined, and photogenic, the perfect officer. She collected promotions and accolades with an easy grace that made my quiet, unseen life seem all the more pale in comparison. It was easier for them to celebrate her than to try and understand me. Over the years, I maintained a distant, dutiful connection. I sent flowers for my mother's birthday, a rare bottle of single malt scotch for my father's, a generous check for Maeve's son's college fund. The gestures were rarely acknowledged directly. A cousin once let it slip during a holiday call that my name was a delicate subject at family gatherings, one that made my mother quiet. It was that same cousin who, a year later, texted me a photo from the family's annual 4th of July gathering at our old cabin on the Hood Canal. It was a beautiful shot of the whole family on the porch, laughing in the summer sun. I remembered the original photo from the year before. I had been in it, standing on the end. In the version she sent, the frame was tighter. I had been neatly cropped out. Mom wanted to balance the composition. She'd explained in a follow-up text, as if I were an inconvenient tree branch. I didn't delete the photo. I kept it as a reminder, not of the hurt, but of the quiet, bloodless efficiency with which I had been excised. I was a ghost in my own history, but I never stopped watching. I read the press release when Maeve made lieutenant commander. I streamed the video of her change of command ceremony. I even recognized a turn of phrase in one of her public speeches, a concept about asymmetrical naval presence that I had first articulated in a policy paper for the Ariadne Initiative 2 years prior. It had been circulated at the highest levels, but she would have had no way of knowing its origin. Or perhaps she did. It didn't matter. I had stopped serving their expectations, but I had never stopped serving. I just learned to do it from the shadows. Then came the invitation. It was a gray Tuesday in late October. The sky over DC was the color of wet pavement, and the air was thick with the smell of rain and decaying leaves. I had just finished a briefing with the Joint Task Force on Atlantic Security when my phone buzzed. The caller ID was a name I hadn't seen in years, Mom. I let it ring twice before answering, my heart a slow, steady drum against my ribs. Her voice was as crisp and starched as a new uniform. Cora, your sister is being promoted to commander next Friday. The ceremony is at the base chapel. You should be there. A long pause hung in the air between us, heavy with everything unsaid. No, how have you been? No, we'd love to see you. Just a directive. Then, a final, clipped instruction. Try to wear something appropriate. And, please, don't make it about you. I'll be there, I said, my voice even. I didn't go seeking forgiveness or demanding recognition. I went to answer a question for myself. Could I walk back into that house, breathe that air, and remain whole? That night, I stood before my closet. Tucked away in a garment bag at the very back was the closest thing I had to a uniform, a tailored, dark gray suit I wore for high-level briefings at the Pentagon. It bore no insignia, no rank, only the quiet authority of its perfect cut. I left it there. Instead, I packed a cream-colored silk blouse, dark wool trousers, and simple leather flats. Civilian. Unassuming. I would let them see the woman they thought they knew. On the long flight to Seattle, I didn't rehearse confrontations or plan speeches. I simply watched the clouds drift by, vast and silent and free. I rented a car and drove north to Port Blossom, the landscape growing more familiar with every mile. The skeletal masts of sailboats in the marina, the scent of cedar and low tide, the persistent gray mist that softened the edges of the world. I arrived at my childhood home an hour before the small family dinner they were hosting. The house stood as it always had, a sturdy sentinel painted a reserved shade of navy blue, the American flag flying from the porch. I knocked, then used the old key I still carried to let myself in. The air inside was warm, smelling of roasted chicken and my mother's lavender potpourri. She was in the dining room, meticulously arranging place cards around the polished mahogany table. She didn't look up. Your room is the same, she said, her focus on aligning a fork. We're eating at 7. Maeve will be here soon. Just try to be pleasant. Not hello. Not welcome home. Just a series of tactical commands for navigating the evening. My father emerged from his study, looking as he always did, like a man perpetually on the verge of inspecting the troops. He wore a pressed polo shirt, and his posture was ramrod straight. He gave me a brisk nod and a pat on the shoulder that felt less like an embrace and more like a correction of my posture. Cora, you made it, he said, his eyes already scanning past me, as if checking the perimeter. It was not a greeting, it was an acknowledgement of my presence on his manifest. The dinner was an intimate affair. My parents, a few of my father's old Navy colleagues and their wives, and Maeve's husband, a cheerful pilot named Liam. I was seated at the far end of the table, next to a woman who had been my mother's friend for 30 years and who spent the first 10 minutes of our conversation calling me Sarah. I smiled and didn't correct her. Maeve arrived last, a vision in her service dress whites. The uniform was immaculate, the gold braid on her sleeve gleaming in the soft light of the dining room. She moved through the room with the practiced confidence of a person accustomed to being its center of gravity, accepting congratulations with a smile that was both brilliant and perfectly controlled. When she finally made her way to my end of the table, she placed a light, cool hand on my shoulder. Everyone, this is my sister, Cora, she announced to the table at large. She was at Annapolis with me for a bit. She works for the government in D.C. now. Something in administration, right? A few polite murmurs went around the table. My mother's friend, the one who thought I was Sarah, leaned in conspiratorially. Well, that's important too, dear, she whispered. Keeps the lights on. Keeps the lights on. I took a slow sip of my water, the condensation cold against my fingers. Something like that, I replied, my voice a quiet murmur. Later, my father stood to propose a toast. He raised his glass to Maeve, to the Navy, to the Donovan tradition of service, and to the children who honor that legacy. I raised my glass with the rest of them, the crystal cool against my lips. I did not drink. After the plates were cleared, Maeve tapped her spoon gently against her wine glass. The clear, ringing sound drew everyone's attention. "I was thinking today," she began, her gaze sweeping over the faces of her admirers, "about what it means to serve. It's not just about putting on the uniform. It's about the promises you keep. It's about seeing a difficult path through to the end and not simply walking away when it gets hard." The words were aimed with surgical precision, a torpedo launched in plain sight. I felt my father's gaze flicker towards me for a half-second. I met it without expression. For years, words like that had felt like stones thrown at me. Now, they were just words, and I had learned that my own sense of self was not a house of glass. After dinner, while the others gathered in the living room to look at a slideshow of Maeve's latest deployment, I slipped into my father's study. The room was a shrine. Framed citations, shadow boxes containing his medals, and photographs. So many photographs. My father as a young ensign. My grandfather on the deck of a destroyer in World War II. And Maeve. Maeve at her commissioning. Maeve shaking hands with an admiral. Maeve in fatigues, smiling under a desert sun. On the main wall, above the fireplace, was a large, professionally framed family portrait taken 10 years ago at the cabin. I looked closely. I knew the original. I had been in it, standing next to Maeve. But in this version, I was gone. The photographer, or perhaps the framer at my mother's request, had cropped the image, centering the shot on my parents and their decorated daughter. I ran my finger along the smooth, cold glass. I wasn't angry. I felt a strange, quiet clarity. You cannot be erased if you know where you stand. I stepped out onto the back porch, closing the door softly behind me. The damp, cool air was a relief. The sky was a deep, starless black, and the only sound was the distant foghorn from the bay, a low, mournful sigh. From behind the glowing windows, I could hear the sound of laughter. For the first time in my life, I heard it not as a sound of my exclusion, but simply as a sound from another room. Tomorrow, I would go to the ceremony. I would sit in my assigned seat. I would clap politely. I would be the quiet, administrative sister they believed me to be. And I would be fine. But there was a truth they didn't know, a current running deep beneath the placid surface of their assumptions. And the truth, I have found, has a way of making its own tide. The base chapel was a study in solemnity and order. Dark, polished wood, stained glass windows depicting naval battles and saintly figures, and rows of pews filled with the crisp white and navy blue of dress uniforms. A palpable sense of reverence filled the air. I found my assigned seat in the family section, a few rows back, next to Maeve's husband Liam and their son, Owen. Maeve stood at the front, poised and radiant. The ceremony was beautiful, steeped in tradition. Her commendations were read, her career highlights recounted. She was, by every conceivable measure, a credit to the institution she served. My father watched her with an expression of profound, unadulterated pride. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. I felt a quiet, detached happiness for my sister. Her success was real. It was earned. It simply wasn't the whole story. When it was her turn to speak, she stepped to the lectern. Her voice was steady, filled with a practiced humility. She thanked her mentors, her family, her fellow officers. She spoke of duty and sacrifice. And then, she paused, letting her gaze drift over the audience. In this life, she said, her voice dropping to a more intimate, reflective tone, we are all faced with choices. And the measure of our character is not in the paths we start, but in the ones we finish. It is a lesson in commitment, a virtue that is proven not by words, but by the willingness to stay the course, no matter how challenging. The message, wrapped in the respectable cloth of inspirational rhetoric, was unmistakable. It was the same theme from the dinner, now delivered to a larger audience. I felt Liam shift slightly beside me. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my gaze fixed on my sister. I felt no sting, no resentment. Only a quiet sorrow for her, that her light felt so fragile it could only shine in my perceived darkness. It was then that the heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel swung open. A man stepped inside, and a subtle ripple of awareness flowed through the room. He was tall and lean, with silver hair and the kind of deep-set eyes that seemed to hold a century of secrets. He wore a civilian suit, but he moved with an authority that no uniform could bestow. It was Admiral Kellen, retired, now a senior civilian advisor to the Secretary of the Navy and a board member for the Ariadne Initiative. A few heads turned. His presence at a commander's promotion was unusual, a sign of significant respect. Maeve faltered for a moment in her speech, her eyes widening slightly before she regained her composure. Admiral Cullen's gaze swept the room, a polite, cursory scan. And then it found me. His expression changed. A look of recognition, of genuine respect, softened his stern features. He began to walk down the central aisle, his polished dress shoes making no sound on the thick runner. He didn't walk toward the front, toward the stage. He walked toward me. The whispers started then, a low rustle like wind in dry leaves. Who is that? Is that Admiral Cullen? He stopped when he reached my pew. The entire chapel was now silent. Maeve had stopped speaking altogether, her notes trembling in her hand. My father was half risen from his seat, his face a mask of confusion. My mother stared, her handkerchief frozen halfway to her face. Admiral Cullen looked directly at me, and in the hushed, sacred space of the chapel, he straightened his shoulders and brought his hand up in a slow, formal salute. It was not a military salute. It was a gesture of profound civilian respect, one reserved for peers of the highest standing. Director Donovan, he said, his voice quiet but carrying with perfect clarity through the still air. A privilege to see you here, ma'am. Director Donovan. The title hung in the air, electric and incomprehensible to the audience. I stood slowly, my movements fluid and unhurried. I inclined my head, a gesture of equal respect. Admiral, I replied, my voice steady. Thank you for coming. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer merely quiet. It was heavy with the weight of 1,000 recalculations. I saw a captain in the front row lean over and whisper something to the officer beside him, his eyes wide. I saw my father slowly sink back into his seat, his mouth slightly agape. I saw Maeve's face, pale and strained, the triumphant glow of her moment utterly extinguished. The rest of the ceremony was a blur. The final prayer, the polite, scattered applause. The spell had been broken. The story they had all believed, the simple, satisfying narrative of the successful sister and the one who quit, had just been ripped apart. In the reception hall afterward, a space that should have been buzzing with congratulations for Maeve, the atmosphere was stilted and strange. People kept glancing at me, whispering in small, tight clusters. I stood by the window, looking out at the gray water of the bay, feeling not triumphant, but strangely calm. Maeve found me there. Her heels clicked sharply on the polished floor, an angry, staccato rhythm. What was that? She hissed, her voice low and furious. You couldn't just let me have this one day? You had to orchestrate this spectacle. I turned to face her, my expression calm. I didn't orchestrate anything, Maeve. I just came to your promotion. Don't lie to me. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears of frustration. You had him do that. To humiliate me. To make me look like a fool in front of my entire command. I looked at my sister, at the beautiful, accomplished woman in the perfect uniform, and for the first time, I saw the deep, terrified insecurity that lay beneath it all. I didn't make you look like anything, I said, my voice gentle but firm. You have spent 20 years telling a story about me. A story where I am small so that you can feel tall. Today, the truth just walked into the room. If your version of success requires my failure, then it was never really success, was it? I didn't wait for her to answer. I turned and walked away, moving through the bewildered crowd, my steps even and sure. I felt their eyes on my back, the weight of their shifting perceptions. They had spent a lifetime looking past me. Now, for the first time, they were truly seeing me, and they had no idea who I was. Let them wonder. I already knew. I checked into a quiet hotel in town, a place with a view of the ferry boats gliding across the Sound. I needed space, a neutral ground where the air wasn't thick with 2 decades of unspoken history. That evening, as a soft rain began to fall, my secure tablet chimed with an encrypted notification. It was from a colleague at Ariadne, a man named Robert who ran our internal network security. The message was brief. Cora, an old anomaly flag on your profile was just tripped by an external query originating from a Dawn network at Navbase Kitsap. The query was trying to access your sealed Academy separation file. Happened 48 hours ago. Thought you should know. Stay safe. A cold not formed in my stomach. 48 hours ago. The night of the family dinner. I pulled up the log. The query was masked, but it had been routed through a temporary guest account on the base network, an account that could have been accessed from any number of public terminals, including the one in the base library. With a few commands, I initiated a deeper trace. Attached to the flagged query was a ghost file, a corrupted data packet that suggested the user had been searching for more than just my separation file. They had been keyword searching my name in connection with sensitive project codenames. Projects that Maeve would have heard mentioned in high-level briefings without knowing I was connected to them. My mind raced back through the years to small, inexplicable professional headwinds I had faced. An unexpected security review. A project proposal mysteriously stalled in committee. A rumor about my unconventional methods that had circulated among a few senior officials. At the time, I had dismissed them as the normal friction of bureaucracy. Now, they looked like something else. Like carefully planted seeds of doubt. The next morning, I drove to the base. I found Maeve in her new, larger office, overlooking the submarine pens. She was unpacking a box of personal effects, placing a framed photo of her son on the corner of her desk. I didn't bother with pleasantries. I stood in the doorway and held up my tablet, the screen showing the security log. Were you looking for something? I asked quietly. She froze, her hand hovering over a stack of books. She glanced at the screen, and a flicker of something, fear, guilt, crossed her face before she masked it with a cool professionalism. I have no idea what that is, she said, turning back to her box. Don't, Maeve, I said, my voice still quiet, but with an edge of steel she had never heard before. A query was launched from this base 2 nights ago, trying to access my sealed record. It was also searching for my involvement in projects you have no clearance for. Projects you've heard mentioned. You were digging for something. What was it? She finally turned to face me, her composure cracking. I just wanted to understand, she burst out, her voice tight with a frustration that seemed years old. You just vanished. You walked away from everything we were raised to be. And then, whispers. Always these little whispers in the hallways at the Pentagon. The Ariadne Initiative. Director Donovan. Vague, powerful things. You weren't supposed to be powerful. You were supposed to be the one who quit. Her confession hung in the air, raw and painful. It wasn't about malice, not entirely. It was about a worldview that had been shattered. So you went looking for proof that I was a failure? I asked. Or worse, that I was a fraud? I just wanted it to make sense, she cried, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. I did everything right. I followed the path, I checked every box, I earned every single stripe on the sleeve. And yet, somehow, you ended up ahead of me. How is that fair? This was never a race, Maeve, I said softly. I looked at my sister, at the lifetime of competition she had constructed in her own mind. The damage you could have done, trying to access those files, you tripped a security alert. Not just on me, on the entire project network. A knock on the open door made us both turn. It was a young lieutenant, looking flustered. Commander Donovan? Ma'am, sorry to interrupt. We have a problem. The primary scheduling network for the Pacific Fleet's submarine division is offline. It's a full system lockdown. No one can get in. Maeve's face went white. The scheduling network. It was housed on the same secure server cluster as the high-level project files she had been trying to access. In her clumsy search for a weapon to use against me, she hadn't just tripped an alarm. She had pulled the pin on a grenade. The next few hours were a controlled storm of activity. The lockdown was a failsafe, a digital quarantine designed to prevent a breach from spreading. But it had paralyzed a critical operational nerve center. Admiral Cullen was on a secure line from DC within minutes. "This has Ariadne's fingerprints all over it, Cora," he said, his voice grim. "The protocols are ours. You know the architecture better than anyone. I need you to lead the diagnostic team. On site. Now." "Understood, Admiral," I replied. I walked into the base's Network Operations Center, a cold, windowless room filled with the low hum of servers and the frantic energy of technicians. My father was already there, having been called in as a retired expert on legacy communication systems. He looked at me, then at the chaos around him, his expression a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. "They said you could help," he stated, his voice flat. "I can," I said simply. I was given temporary command of the response team. I directed a young cyber warfare specialist to trace the lockdown's origin point. I had my father start mapping the system's archaic subprotocols, and then I turned to Maeve, who stood by the door, looking small and lost. "I need your command access codes," I said, my voice even. "All of them. And I need you to walk me through every step you took 2 nights ago. Every search term. Every file you tried to open. No omissions." She nodded, her eyes filled with a terror that had finally eclipsed her pride. For the next 6 hours, we worked. I became Director Donovan in full, moving from station to station, translating the complex, esoteric language of Ariadne's systems for the naval technicians. I was calm, precise, and in complete control. My father watched me, his role reduced to providing me with data points as I requested them. I saw the slow, seismic shift in his understanding. He was watching his daughter, the one who pushed papers, navigate a crisis that had stumped his entire world. He saw not a quitter, but a commander of a different sort, one whose authority came not from a rank on her collar, but from the quiet, absolute confidence of her expertise. Maeve, humbled and silent, did exactly as I asked. She sat beside me, her voice a low murmur as she recounted her digital trespasses. She was my key, the ghost in the machine that I needed to track. Working with her, side by side, the anger I should have felt was replaced by a strange, weary sadness. We were the Donovan sisters, 2 sides of the same coin, and we had almost allowed the world to spin us into different orbits entirely. Finally, after hours of painstaking work, I found the flaw. Her unauthorized query had triggered a logic bomb, a dormant piece of code I had designed years ago to protect the system's core. It wasn't a malicious attack, it was a fortress door slamming shut. And I was the only one with the key to reopen it. With a final sequence of commands, I disarmed the protocol. The screens in the room blinked from red to green. The network came back online. A collective sigh of relief went through the room. In the quiet aftermath, my father walked over to me. He stood for a moment, just looking at me, his eyes filled with a complex mix of awe and regret. "The work you do," he started, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. He simply reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder. This time, it wasn't a shove or a correction. It was a gesture of contact, of connection. Later that evening, I found Maeve on the pier, watching the lights of a destroyer as it headed out to sea. "It's done," I said, coming to stand beside her. She didn't look at me. "They're going to open an investigation. I'll be court-martialed. My career is over." "No," I said. "The official report will state that the lockdown was triggered by a flaw in a recent software update. A flaw that I have now corrected. Your name will not be in it." She finally turned to me, her face streaked with tears. "Why? After everything, why would you do that for me?" I looked out at the dark water, at the vast, open horizon. Because you're my sister, I said. And because your service is real. You earned that uniform. You just forgot that its value doesn't depend on diminishing mine. I paused, then added, but this is the last time, Maeve. The last time you try to tear me down to build yourself up. From now on, we build together. Or we don't build at all. She nodded, a single, sharp movement. Okay, she whispered. Okay. I left Port Blossom the next morning. Before I went to the airport, I stopped by the house. My mother was in the kitchen, drinking coffee. She looked up when I came in, her expression unreadable. She simply said, "Your father told me what you did." She stood up, walked over to the mantelpiece, and picked up the cropped family photograph. She looked at it for a long moment, then set it down, face first, on the table. "We need to take a new one," she said. It wasn't an apology, not in words. But it was a start. It was the sound of a door, long closed, creaking open. As I drove away, I didn't feel a sense of victory. I felt a quiet sense of peace. I hadn't come home to win a war with my family. I had come home to see if I could survive it. I had discovered something more profound. I didn't need to survive them anymore. I just needed to be me. The ghost was gone, not because they had finally seen me, but because I had finally stopped trying to be invisible. And in the space I had claimed for myself, there was finally room for them to join me.